Nigel Blake arrived in Oxford at 5:20 in the afternoon and went straight to the Mason Sceptre, where he booked a room. The hotel, he reflected sadly as his taxi drove up to it, was not one of the architectural glories of Oxford. It was built in a curious amalgam of styles, which reminded him of nothing so much of as an enormously large and horribly depressing nightclub come restaurant. He'd once visited one like it near Brandenburger Tor in Berlin, where every room impersonated some different national style in an aggressive, romantic, and improbable way. His own room appeared to him like a grotesque parody of a baptistry in Pisa. He unpacked, washed off the dirt and discomfort which a rail journey always involves, and wandered downstairs in search of a drink. By now it was 6:30. In the bar and lounge, the civilized progelamina to sex operated a restrained, objectionable puppet show. A corpse of painted Gothic overlooked these proceedings. In general, the place was much the same as Nigel remembered it, though the undergraduate population had dropped, and the military risen considerably. A few belated theological students of the arty type, who had remained presumably to work during the vacation, or who had come up a few days early, whined and gibbered in a discussion of the poetic beauty of the conception of the virgin birth. A group of RAF officers by the bar swallowed their beer with noisy jejune enthusiasm, and there were one or two very old men, and a miscellaneous riffraff of art students, and schoolmasters, and visiting celebrities who sat about hoping to be noticed, and without whom Oxford is never complete. A motley collection of women attached to the younger men, and for the most part engaged in manipulating and focusing their attention upon themselves, completed the gathering. One or two Indian students idled rather aggressively about, ostentatiously bearing volumes of the better-known contemporary poets. Nigel found himself a drink and an empty chair, and settled down with a little sigh of relief. Decidedly the place had not altered. In Oxford, he thought, the faces change, but the types persist, doing and saying identical things from one generation to the next. He lit a cigarette and stared about him, and wondered whether to go and see Fenn that evening or not. At 7:20, Robert Warner and Rachel came in. Nigel knew Robert slightly, a tenuous acquaintance based on a series of literary luncheons and theatrical parties and first nights. He gave him a cheerful little wave. "May we join you?" said Robert. "Or are you meditating?" "Not at all. Let me get you a drink." And thanking heaven that Robert was not the kind of man immediately to clamour, "No, let me get you one," he found out what they wanted and went to the bar. On his return, he found them talking to Nicholas Berkeley. Introductions were performed, and Nigel trailed off again to the bar. Eventually they all got settled and sat for a moment in silence, gazing expectantly at one another and sipping their drinks. "I'm looking forward enormously to seeing your play next week," said Nigel to Robert. "Though I must admit I'm a bit surprised at putting it on here." "Well, it's a case of needs must. My last thing was such a miserable flop in the West End, I had to go to the provinces. The only consolation is that I shall be able to produce it myself. That's not a thing I've been allowed to do for years." "Only a week's rehearsal on a new play," said Nicholas. "That's going to be a sweat." "Well, it's a tryout, really. Various agents and managers are coming down from London to confirm their belief that I am, in fact, a dandelion seed in the wind, and that I've lost all my mind. I'm hoping to disappoint them, though God knows what sort of production it will be. This place has become a repository for callow children out of the dramatic schools, with a substratum of old crocks and one or two of the most notorious hams in Europe. Whether I shall be able to beat them into proper use of timing, gesture, and intonation in a week, I really can't imagine. But Rachel's going to be in it, and she'll help." "Frankly, I doubt it. An outsider starring in repertory for box-office purposes creates more bad feeling than anything else. You know, mutterings in corners." "What's the theatre like? I hardly went near it when I was up here," Nigel asked. "You mean you worked?" "It's not a bad theatre. An old place, put up somewhere in the 1860s, but modernised just before the war. I was working there about 10 years ago. My God, it was awful then. Squeaky dimmers, erratic tabs, flats that fell over at a touch. All that's been done away with now, though. Some good soul with money and ambitions crammed the place with every convenience, including a revolve." Revolve? Revolving stage. Like a circular turntable divided across the middle. You set the next scene on the side hidden from the audience, and then, when the time comes, you just twiddle it round. It means you can't have flaps projecting onto it from the wings, and that rather limits you in composition of your sets. As a matter of fact, I don't think they use it much here. It's a sort of white elephant. Certainly I shan't. But it's a nuisance because you lose an enormous depth of stage you could very well do with. And what, said Nicholas, settling back more comfortably in his chair, is the play about? Or is that giving away trade secrets? The play? Oh, it's a rewrite of a thing of the same name by a very minor French dramatist called Piron. You probably know the story. It's about 1730, I think it was. Voltaire began to receive verses from a Mademoiselle Malcré de la Vignée, to which he gallantly responded, and a huge correspondence sprang up between them, all very amorous and literary. Anyway, later on, she came to Paris and turned out to Voltaire's fury and everyone else's delight to be a great fat youth called Desforges Méland. Piron used the situation, you see, as the basis of his play, and I've taken it over and modified it, reversing the sexes, though, and making the chief character a woman novelist and her correspondent a mischievous woman journalist. I know it doesn't sound up to much, but that's really only the bare bones of the thing. Who's playing the woman novelist? Oh, Rachel, of course. Lovely part for her. And the journalist? Yes, well, I'm still uncertain about that. I think Helen. Yuziette's quite incapable of playing comedy. Anyway, I dislike her so much I simply couldn't bear it. There's one other girl apart from the older women, but I'm told she does such extraordinary things on the stage I simply couldn't give her anything more than a bit part. There is one other girl in the company apart from the older women, but I'm told she does extraordinary things on the stage. I simply mustn't give her anything more than a bit part. I'm giving Yuziette a bit part too, only on in the first act. But I shall insist on her taking a curtain every night, so she can't take off her makeup and go home. Phew. Nicholas took out a cigarette case, opened it, and balanced it on the table with a gesture of invitation. Yuziette is very unpopular. I never met anyone who had a good word to say for her. Nigel, as he took a cigarette, flicked his lighter and handed it round the little group. He thought he saw a gleam of interest appear in Robert's eye. Who in particular dislikes her? Well, myself, for one, Nicholas shrugged, on more or less irrational grounds, though I do have a friend who's making a bloody fool of himself over her. I am as true as truth's simplicity, and simpler than the infancy of truth, you know. Helen, for another, what a sister to have to drag about with one. Jean, oh, you don't know her, of course, a girl called Jean Whiteleg. She's in love with the Troilus aforementioned, the humble village maiden waiting for her knight to stop fooling about with his wicked princess. Who else dislikes her? Oh, yes, everyone in the company, because she's an intolerable little bitch. Sheila McGaw, because, oh, God! He broke off abruptly. Looking up to see what had caused the interruption, Nigel saw Yuziette come into the bar. Talk of the devil! And she's sure to appear. Nigel studied Yuziette curiously, as, with Donald Fellows, she came into the bar. He was struck by her total lack of resemblance to Helen. The brief interchange he had just heard interested him, though for the moment he was inclined to be more than superciliously amused at the antagonism which the girl seemed to arouse. She looked a compound of negative qualities, conceit, selfishness, coquetry, and a little more besides. Later he was to appreciate malice as a positive quality. She was dressed very simply in a blue sweater and blue slacks which set off the red of her hair. Nigel noticed the almost imperceptible traces of disagreeableness in her features, and sighed. But for that, a model whom Rubens or Renoir would have delighted to paint. Certainly, Nigel admitted to himself, with perhaps a little more than mere scientific interest, she had a magnificent body. By comparison, Donald Fellows seemed uninteresting. He moved awkwardly and with little address. Nigel thought he recognized him, but where on earth had he come across him before? He made a futile, indefinite attempt to summon up the memory of his acquaintance during the years at Oxford, but, as always happens on these occasions, could not remember a single one. Only a phantom pantomime of blank, indistinguishable masks. Fortunately, the problem was solved for him by a gleam of recognition which appeared in Donald's eye. Nigel smiled feebly, foreseeing a certain amount of gaucherie and embarrassment in the near future. He never had the courage simply to tell people that he didn't remember them. Then followed the ceremonies of mumblings, apologies, and recognitions which always occur when a group of people only partially acquainted are brought together, and a great and complicated manoeuvring of chairs. Nigel, about to go off once again to the bar, was forestalled by Nicholas, who, as he ordered pink gins, contemplated with unconcealed glee the extremely uncomfortable relationships which were likely to be established within the next few minutes. Yuziette, after a perfunctory and apparently pejorative survey of Nigel, attached herself firmly to Robert. Rachel talked to Donald, and Nigel and Nicholas sat listening in comparative silence. Yuziette began by being solemnly reproachful. "I wish you'd allowed me to play the journalist. I know it's silly to argue about casting, but frankly I've had much more experience of that sort of thing than Helen, and I thought perhaps in view of the fact that we knew each other so well—" "Do we know each other so well? I didn't think you would have forgotten so quickly." "My dear child, it's not a question of forgetting. You know damn well we never got on together. And as for bringing that up over a question of casting, it's not just the casting, Robert, and you know that as well as I do. You behaved damn badly to me, and I haven't had as much as a line from you since. In anyone else it would have been intolerable. Are you thinking of suing me for breach of promise? I assure you you'll have a job." "Don't be such a bloody fool." "No, I shouldn't have said that. I suppose in a way it was my fault that I couldn't keep you, even as your mistress." "I already had a mistress. This conversation, thought Robert, is getting damned awkward, much worse than I expected." Aloud he said, "And anyway, Yuziette, I thought we agreed about all this long ago. It's had no influence on the casting, if that's what you mean." What a lie, he thought. But if people will be so intolerable— "I've missed you, Robert." "My dear, I've missed you too, in a way." Conventions of polite behaviour were beginning to sap Robert's firmness. Yuziette looked at him with wide, innocent eyes in which there were a hint of tears. He half expected her to lisp when she spoke. "Couldn't we take it up again, darling?" "No, dear, I'm afraid we couldn't. Even if it were possible, from my point of view, which it isn't. What about that young man Donald? What's his name? You know, sitting there, making sheep's eyes at you." "Donald! My dear, surely you credit me with sufficient good taste not to take seriously a youth like that." "He's of the male gender. I thought that was your only requirement." "Oh, don't be cynical, darling." He marvelled at the lack of dignity which could have prompted her to such an offer. Half in curiosity, he began to probe again. "Besides, Helen tells me he's very much in love with you. Surely you owe him sufficient consideration not to go about asking other young men point-blank to go to bed with you." "I can't help it if people fall in love with me. It's not my responsibility." "If you don't love him, make a clean break." "Don't talk like a twopenny novelette, Robert. He's hopelessly young and silly and clumsy and inexperienced, and ridiculously jealous, too. God, how I hate Oxford! How I hate the silly bloody fools who surround me here, and the theatre and everything about the filthy place. There's nothing to stop you leaving, I suppose. The West End is waiting tensely for you to decide what part you want to play next, and opposite who. Oh, damn you!" "Pleasant reminiscences?" inquired Nicholas from the middle distance, who had caught the last few phrases of the conversation. "Shut up, Nick. As far as success is concerned, you're no shining light." Nigel saw Nicholas's expression harden. "How fortunate it is that I have no reason in the world to be polite to bitches like you." You little... Robert, are you going to sit there and let him talk to me like that? Oh, shut up, Yuziet. And you shut up too, Nick. I've no wish to be surrounded by squabbling children all evening. Have a cigarette. It was an unpleasant little incident, one of several such, designed to culminate in murder. And what had astonished Nigel had been the sight of Donald Fellows during those few seconds. Literally, the man had been shaking with rage. His hand had trembled as he took a cigarette from Robert's case and lit it, throwing away the match without attempting to offer it to anyone else. The blood had drained from his face and the sweat had started out on his brow. Nigel was so alarmed that he half rose from his chair, afraid Donald was going to smash Nicholas with the first thing that came to hand. But he controlled himself, fortunately. But Nigel realized this was a strong passion that he held for Yuziet. He marvelled. It was Rachel who restored the situation. "Are you going to be here long?" she asked quietly to Nigel. Nigel played up nobly. "Yes, about a week, I think. I'm reviving memories, you see." His eye travelled uneasily round the gathering as he spoke, and he was relieved to see that they were all sulking. "Though, of course, there are very few people I know up here now. It's funny how little the place has changed, despite the war. I wonder, Robert, if I might watch some of the rehearsals of your play? If the company doesn't object, that is. I know so little about the theatre. I'm sure it would be good for me." "By all means. We run through the whole thing tomorrow. Oh, just reading, of course. Then Act 1 will be set on Wednesday, Act 2 and Act 3 on Thursday, run through on Friday, Saturday the dress. Then Sunday evening and Monday we piece together the fragments of the dress rehearsal. And there we are. I dare say one or two of the older members of the company will object to having people hanging about, but they will just have to lump it." "Oh, well, I mean, if it's going to be a nuisance, good heavens, no. Just make yourself fairly inconspicuous, that's all. Donald What's-his-name is coming whenever he can get away from his choir boys, and so is a Don I met yesterday called Gervase Fenn. All the impossible names. It's good enough for one of my plays." "Oh, you've met Fenn, have you?" "Yes." "Is he a friend of yours?" "He used to be my tutor. How did you come across him?" "Quite by accident, in Blakewell's. He was reading a book off one of the shelves, going to the rather extreme length of cutting the pages with a penknife. When one of the assistants ticked him off, he said solemnly, 'Young man, this bookshop was dunning me for enormous bills long before you were born, so go away at once or I'll cut out all the pages and scatter them on the floor.' The assistant went in some dismay, and he turned to me and said, 'Do you know, I was afraid I was going to have to.' We chatted for a bit. He seemed struck dumb on learning who I was, gaped at me, asked a lot of solemn, quite idiotic questions about how I thought of things and whether I enjoyed writing and whether I dictated plays to a secretary. Is it a pose, by the way? I didn't think it was, but I was a bit taken aback. No, it isn't. He's always had a sort of naive enthusiasm for the celebrated. It's refreshing at first, but it does become a bore. One gets so ashamed of him at parties. Anyway, the upshot is I invited him to come along to rehearsals, for which he was quite pathetically grateful. However, towards the end of our conversation, he began to shuffle his feet and fidget about and look at his watch, so I politely took my leave. He rushed away with tremendous strides, saying, oh dear, I shall be late," like the White Rabbit in Alice, looking over a pile of pamphlets on Russia, and absent-mindedly taking with him the book he'd been looking at. Obviously he couldn't make out where it had come from, because later I saw him take it into Parker's and exchange it for a detective novel. Nigel emitted a sound which can only be described as an explosive snort. When he had recovered, he said, "I'm going to see him after dinner tonight. Say, would you like to come?" Thanks, but it really can't be managed. I'm going on Friday, when I have got this play off my mind a bit." At this point there suddenly appeared at the table the young artillery captain to whom Yuziet had spoken in the train. He wore a bashful smile. Nigel had seen him at an adjacent table, his attention torn between the conclusion of No Orchids for Miss Blandish and the charms of Rachel, which had obviously smitten him severely. "Excuse my butting in," he said, addressing himself chiefly to Yuziet. "We met in the train. I was getting awfully bored sitting there all on my ownio. You see, I don't know anyone in Oxford yet." A confused clamour of invitation arose. "Oh, well, thanks awfully. Do let me get you all another drink." He rushed away and returned with his arms full of glasses, spilling the greater part of their contents on the floor. In the meantime, Donald Fellows rose abruptly and left without a word. "All comes from practice," said the captain proudly, depositing the drinks in an unsteady manner on the table and sitting down with a bump. "My name's Peter Graham, Captain Peter Graham, His Majesty's Royal Artillery, at your service." He grinned at each of them in turn. Rachel took charge of the introductions, and the conversation drifted into indifferent channels. Rachel, after a brief wink at Robert, resigned herself to the respectful attentions of Peter Graham, who was inquiring hopefully whether the reputation of actresses for immorality was justified. Robert was thrown back on Usiette again, while Nigel and Nicholas discussed their undergraduate days and found acquaintances in common. Eventually Peter Graham surged to his feet. "I say, I wonder if you'd all like to come to a party in my rooms here on Wednesday night, after the bars have closed, of course. Do bring lots of people. I think the hotel will let me have plenty to drink, so you needn't bring bottles. Oh, and in the meantime," he added, after they'd all murmured expressions of delighted acquiescence, "Rachel, I mean Miss West and I are going to have dinner together, so I hope you will excuse us now." Here Robert shot a desperate glance at Rachel, who mischievously refused to notice it. "So long. I expect I shall see you all about. I think I'm going to like Oxford." He whisked Rachel away before anyone could say a word. Nigel and Nicholas also began to make movements of departure. "I must be off now," Nicholas said firmly. "No, don't go," said Robert hurriedly. "Stay and have dinner with us." He waved his hand dejectedly in the direction of Usiette and semaphored distress signals. "Oh, I'd love to, but I'm afraid I'm dining with a friend in New College, and I'm late already." "What about you?" Robert addressed Nigel. But Nigel had absolutely no wish to dine with Usiette. "I'm sorry, but I'm afraid I've got an engagement too." "Oh dear. Oh, by the way, what time is the rehearsal tomorrow?" "It's 10 o'clock. They left him sunk in gloom, and Usiette smiling like an overfed cat. In the doorway a somewhat drunk RAF officer cannoned into Nicholas, and, recovering himself, stared at him blearily for a few seconds. "Bloody type! Why the hell aren't you in uniform? Bloody type!" "I am part of the culture you're fighting to defend," said Nicholas, looking at him coolly. He'd been invalided out of the army after Dunkirk. "You're a bloody pongo!" Feeling his vocabulary now exhausted, the RAF officer went his way. Nigel looked curiously at his companion as they left the hotel. "I should imagine Coriolanus is one of your favourite plays?" Nicholas smiled. "In a way, you're right. The common cry of curs, you mean. But it's not snobbishness. It's just a congenital inability to suffer fools gladly. I think that's the chief reason, not any moral scruples, that I loathe that bitch Usiette. Someone is going to kill or mutilate that girl one day, and I, for one, shan't be sorry." Outside, Nigel left him, and as he strolled back to dine at his college, he was more than usually thoughtful.